Welcome, everyone, to this webinar book presentation of a documentary history of Jewish-Christian relations, which has the subtitle From Antiquity to the Present Day. We have with us today the principal editor of this 600-page volume, Edward Kessler, Professor Edward Kessler, who is the founder and president of the Wolf Institute, which is a academic center in Cambridge, United Kingdom, dedicated to promoting understanding and dialogue among Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Edward is also a fellow at St. Edmund's College, University of Cambridge. Two others are joining me today on this discussion. Professor Susanna Heschel, the Eli Black Distinguished Professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College. She is the chair of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College and of the program there at Dartmouth College, and a professor in the religion department. Welcome, Susanna. And Father Dennis McManus, who's a professor of theology at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California. Father McManus is also a delegate for Jewish Affairs of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops and a senior research fellow at Georgetown University in the Office of the President. I'm John Borelli. I too am a senior research fellow at Berkeley Center here at Georgetown University and a special assistant to the president of the university. Now, those of you who have followed Jewish-Christian relations over the years certainly recognize the names of Professor Kessler, Professor Heschel, and Father McManus, and we're delighted to have everyone with us today. This is a monumental project, I should say, this 13th book of Professor Kessler's. And I'm going to ask you, Edward, if you wouldn't mind, to open up by discussing what you hope to accomplish by this collection, how it fits into your understanding of what is needed, and a quick look at the overall outline of the book. Edward.
Thanks so much, John. It's a pleasure to be with you and lovely to see Father Dennis after many years and Professor Susanna. It's a great delight to be together. So thank you for the invitation. As far as the book is concerned, the history of the relationship between Jews and Christians stretches over 2,000 years, but is still a relatively young subject of academic study. Although the distinctiveness, even uniqueness of the relationship has long been noted, historical studies have tended to focus on particular moments or brief periods or individual figures or geographical regions. There are, of course, many theological works that consider the relationship, sometimes from the perspective of a shared scripture, as well as a small number of introductory works. But until now, there has existed, as far as I know, no single collection of primary documents which offer a chronological and thematic approach to the entire history of Jewish-Christian relations worldwide. The story and the history of Jewish-Christian relations is told through 200 documents over 2,000 years. And you can imagine the bigger challenge was choosing which documents not to include, as well as those to include. And these documents include a wide range of different types of writing, biblical texts, of course, theological writings, but also political tracts, newspaper articles, diaries, sermons, speeches, letters, novels, plays, a trial record, as well as conference proceedings and scholarly works. Each document is accompanied by a 500-word commentary and has been chosen because it fulfills one of three criteria, normally more than one. It sheds light on the Jewish-Christian relationship at the time it was written. Is it influential on the historical development of Jewish-Christian relations? And it addresses a central theme in the Jewish-Christian relationship. I'm going to share with you the contents and the chronological order, as I think that will be helpful for you to see. Now, you can see the contents are divided into three parts. Part one covers the period up to the 9th century. Part two, from the 10th to the 18th, and part three, from the beginning of the 19th century to the present day. In addition to the chronological chapters, I've included 2 appendices, which present at the end of part 1, case studies of exegetical encounters, because Jews and Christians share a biblical culture. And at the end of part 3, a series of institutional statements on Jewish-Christian relations since the end of the Second World War. One of the challenges of preparing a documentary history is to contextualize the documents in order to help the reader understand the role of institutions and practices of the pre-modern world, which are not always intelligible today. And so each document includes not only a commentary, but also a short bibliography. And the documents cover the entire history of Jewish-Christian relations, from Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians in the 40s, the earliest text in the New Testament, to the statement on Jewish-Christian relations released jointly by the Office of the Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregations of Great Britain and the Commonwealth and the Church of Scotland. The history of Jewish-Christian relations is in many ways an echo chamber, with resonances sounding from the earliest period to the latest, and between voices and events at every stage in between. So this book, The Documentary History, reflects the massive changes of attitude and approach to Jewish-Christian relations that have taken place over the centuries, most strikingly, of course, since the beginning of modern Zionism and the Christian rediscovery of a more constructive relationship with Jews and Judaism in the late 19th century. As such, it embodies the latest scholarly thinking in the field of Jewish-Christian relations and many other disciplines on which it draws. Let me end by highlighting 4 themes which have been prominent at different historical moments and shed light on the entangled history of Jewish-Christian relations, and I believe provide a lens through which to gauge a sense of direction in the future. Firstly, the Bible and its interpretation. Secondly, polemic and anti-Jewish violence. Thirdly, the land, and in particular today, the state of Israel. And finally, dialogue itself. So in sum, this book fills a gap to have a comprehensive single volume of Jewish-Christian relations worldwide. It, I hope, is accessible as well as authoritative. It's certainly something as a teacher of Jewish-Christian relations I've wanted my students to have access to. And thirdly, it's a resource for both Jews and Christians to read and understand what happened over 2,000 years, as well as the how and the why. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Edward. That's very helpful. Let me just say that one may gather by looking at the number of texts and the number of pages and the expanse of time that these massive changes, which are quite apparent beginning in the 19th century and coming into the 20th century, are only then. And you did say, no, it's most impressively beginning about the time of Zionism. Actually, you end the Enlightenment chapter with the letter of George Washington to the community of Jews in Rhode Island, which is all rather positive about the place of all communities in this new republic. So it's a nice little transitional text, but there's about 15 to 23 documents in each of the 9 chapters, and they vary from one to the next. But there are some positive statements that we find where there's some outreaches, some reflections that are helpful. And I think those who know a great deal about the field probably are thinking, oh, these other texts, they would have been so good to put in there too, to kind of offset this and that. But as you said, it's an echo chamber, that things said 1,500 years ago are heard today, or things that were said 300 years ago were repeating what was said 1,700 years ago. So it's quite interesting. I might also say, since you had 9 scholars working with you in this volume, each of them taking different parts, mostly preparing commentaries, but that varied from place to place. And I would say that biblical scholars would probably say, okay, here are all these, I think 22 texts from the New Testament. And then you add Josephus, which is good. It kind of throws in contemporary there. But probably biblical scholars would say, well, but maybe I should check a biblical commentary on those. I should check. Well, I've got another commentary on Matthew. Maybe I should see if I agree with this editor. So you have always, the book is not meant to be a final word. I think it opens up so many more discussions, very positive discussions. Let me turn it over now to Professor Heschel. Susanna, let's hear your reflections and maybe a question or so for Edward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be with you, and this is indeed a monumental accomplishment, and I appreciate it very much. I see this as a culmination of many decades of important scholarship on a whole set of the topics that you include in this volume, that is scholarship on the Bible and on the Middle Ages and so forth. So it's a culmination, but it's also an inauguration, because what your work now has done for us is to open us to new ways of thinking, new kinds of projects that we should undertake, new kinds of questions that we should ask. So I would say the selection of the documents is superb. In addition, the introductions to each section of the book are extremely helpful. The introductions also place the different documents within the history of scholarship and discussion and debate, and that's very helpful. So I want to express my really great appreciation for the work that you've done. I also, though, would like to say that questions come up for me in reading this. I would say, for example, which of these Christian texts about Jews have been most important to Jews versus to Christians? There are some documents that are very well known to Christians, some of the recent statements by Christian denominations, for example, that Jews are barely aware of or sometimes dismiss. I think we're also facing a problem in the Jewish world that October 7th, this Hamas-led massacre that left 1,200 Israelis and some additional nationals, Thais among others, murdered and taken hostage, a couple of hundred, and then killed, and so on, that this actually led almost immediately to a new wave of anti-Semitism throughout the world, which has shocked many people and has also reinforced an old Jewish idea, Esav soned Yaakov, that the Gentiles hate the Jews forever. It's just something that can never be gotten rid of. And that has led to a pessimism, at least in the Jewish world. And I think this volume would be a challenge for us as Jews to think anew, and also to ask to what extent, or perhaps which texts in this volume would be helpful to us at this particular moment after October 7th, to help us understand the sudden international outbreak of anti-Semitism, and also to help us try to counter it in some way. I also, in addition to that, I have some other questions that were sparked by your work. One is how Jews or Judaism functions sometimes implicitly within Christian theological formations, never in an explicit way, but implicitly. I wonder, for example, about some of the concerns in the early church and even later with sexuality, with Mary's virginity, with purity regarding sexuality. If that has something to do implicitly with a Christian effort to define Christianity apart from Judaism, to set a boundary, a distinction, or even a kind of purification of the Christian message from elements of Judaism that Christians felt adhered to it. I also wonder if we might think about ethnography in addition to written texts, ethnography, rituals, fantasies, things that that's why we have the ethnographers who might go out and talk to people who don't write, who may not read and write, but who nonetheless are devout as Christians, who have attitudes toward Jews and Judaism. I'm thinking now of the work of a colleague of mine at Dartmouth, Rachel Feldman, who's looked at Christian evangelicals in the Philippines, very poor people who have shifted more and more into Jewish religious observance, who bring Hebrew into their prayers, who wear a yarmulke, the men, and a talit, and so on. A kind of integration of Judaism into their religious practice, even though they come out of a Christian realm, they're somewhere in between. They call themselves Noahides at times. Are they? And they learn about Judaism, not because there are synagogues, there aren't, but through the internet. So we have now a phenomenon of digital religion. And their Judaism is not text-based. They're not studying the Talmud, and they're not being taught by rabbis sitting with them, but it's very different. It's about ritual and a certain kind of performance, one might say. I know that there are also churches where there's a Passover Seder. Is that solidarity with Judaism? Is that an example of philo-Semitism? Or is it an example of a kind of what people like to call appropriation? I don't know. It's a question. And I know that some people find it offensive and others think that's a wonderful embrace, let's say. And then, of course, I would just wonder in this project, why this project at this moment? So it is a culmination of scholarship that for the most part is a post-World War II, not entirely, but primarily post-World War II. And I wonder what brought that about. Some of it, I think, is because of the shock and horror of the rise of fascism, of anti-Semitism, of racism, of the Holocaust. That's clear. But I think there might be other elements. I think that the process of Europeans moving out of the colonies, the colonization, this process of decolonization, might have given rise to the notion that we must stop theological supersessionism, which I've written about as a form of theological colonialism. So is the political decolonization process also reflected in the theological efforts to move out of supersessionism? Or one could say, or in addition, perhaps as part of the Cold War, that we had to get our religious house in order and unite the way Kevin Schultz writes about in Tri-Faith America. We have to unite as religious movements against the communists, the communist world. So these are just some of the questions I might have in this. I think that what is also important in your book, and this is my final point, is that you demonstrate to us that people of profound religious faith are not necessarily always the people who are opposed to an appreciation of other people's religious faith. And that's something that I think is very important for us to recognize. That is, it's not just the people who are very, very left-wing politically and theologically who are interested in interfaith relations. And I appreciate that. And it's certainly something that my father believed very strongly. As a person of faith, coming to appreciate the holiness of other faiths, that becomes the foundation that allows us to come together to, in fact, help foster the piety of one another. So we don't see interfaith as a challenge to me theologically, but on the contrary, as a strengthening of who I am. So thank you again, Professor Ed, for your
Thank you,
project.
Susanna. That's terrific. Edward, there's quite a bit that Susanna has asked you. Maybe if I ask you to pick and choose what you think ought to be immediately brought into response, and we can get back to some of the comments that Susanna has made. And while I'm mentioning this, I see that two have already found the Q&A function. So please, if you have questions, use the Q&A function and we'll try to get to those towards the end of our discussion.
Thanks, John. Thank you, Susanna. I love the description of the book as an inauguration. I will definitely appropriate that in my reflections on it. You raise 5 points that I jotted down. And of course, the book was prepared before October the 7th, 2023. It was actually published afterwards, so we managed to include a remark or two in the introduction, but not in any of the text. But you ask what text would be helpful now. And I think that's a really important question. And I'm just going to share the final chapter by Mary Boyes, which includes an article of yours, Susanna, because it's the most recent, since 78 through to 2020. And even though all of these selections are pre October the 7th, 2023, there are some texts there, not least your own, that explores what anti-Semitism is, but also texts that allow for Palestinian Christian voices, because that's part of the conversation. I'm thinking in particular David Neuhaus's work and his article there with Alain Machador, as well as Christian voices that are more embracing of Zionism, particularly Gerald McDermott, and in the document, the chapter that includes the text, you've obviously got the Christian Embassy in Jerusalem, as well as Kairos, Palestine. And I think it's really important to see the variety of voices that explore issues of Zionism, modern Zionism, and really grapple with it. I find that chapter, looking back on it from today's date of the 26th of March, 2025, helpful in my reflections on the tragedy and the growth of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic acts, as well as reflecting on the place of Israel. I won't be able to answer all your questions. I'm sure we'll do that in summer discussion, but I did want to just pick up on one other thing, but I perhaps afterwards, I'll be able to come back to all your points, which is the why now? Why now? And the reason is, when I established what was the Centre for Jewish Christian Relations, as the Wolf Institute was called back in 1998, I recognized the field of study did not have the key texts. And as a teacher or as a student, you need key texts. There are plenty of texts on Jewish studies, on Christian theology, on anti-Semitism, on Zionism, but not on the encounter. And that's why there was the dictionary that was published back in 2004, 800 entries from Aaron through to Zola. There was the journal that still goes on out of BC that Ruth Langer co-edits. Really important to have that journal. There's the introduction to Jewish Christian Relations that I wrote in 2010. And this feels to me the last of the pillars of the study, to have a one-volume history. And that's why the timing is what it is. And I appreciated your final remark about appreciating other faiths. You mentioned your father, and I was also thinking of Christos Stendhal. I'm speaking to you from Boston. I'm lecturing later at the Divinity School, where Christos was dean many years ago, and he used this wonderful term, holy envy, which may be familiar. That is, there is something in another faith tradition that you're envious of in a positive way. And I love that expression, because there are so many things in somebody else's faith that I admire. And I learn more about myself in conversation with somebody else. And that's the thread that's run through my writings and my work, but also, I hope, through this documentary history that tries to be honest, that transparent, critical, calls a spade, but also sees the sense of direction over 2,000 years. But thank you so much for your remarks, and hopefully we'll be able to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Edward. Thank you very much. Father McManus.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Ed, for the invitation to be a co-panelist with such a distinguished group of people, and a very fine occasion on the publication of this new volume. There's genius, I think, in this volume. And that is what's been said before, is that nobody's really tried this project before. This is new ground to put something together for us. And it reflects, if I may say so, I think certain tendencies, certain of your previous scholarly work, say in the Dictionary of Christian-Jewish Relations from 2004, trying to fill in so many of the stepping stones, if I can call it that way, in this very long, troubled history, getting the details down. Because once you've got that in at least to the degree that you have now, then the long view is credible. You can construct a long view. We have enough of the small spots filled in, and I think that makes this volume really possible. It isn't just the genius of seeing what the scene really needed and where the gap was, is that you laid the groundwork for this by all those detailed historical and theological articles earlier. So quite good. I also think that the wide selection of sources is another huge commendable piece of this, including more than the kind of expected formal writings of patristic, medieval, and Reformation period. We all expect those. They're rounding up the usual suspects in anti-Judaism, as it were. We know that. But what you've done is allow for a huge shift in our culture in the West, and that is this, a turn to the self, where you've allowed witnesses, internal reflection, experience, diaries, personal stuff to come out and be a part of the history. Beautiful. This is a very important turn in the resources of putting this picture together, because in the postmodern period, who we are as persons matters to us perhaps more than anything else. And you've allowed your documentary history to go from institutional to personal, including these resources. I thought it was fabulous, especially because from where I sit as a petrologist, the key moment here is the way in which the Shoah itself opened up the interior expression of both Jews and Christians together. The Shoah seems to be a key in allowing an interiorization to be made public. It's a huge sharing, and you've captured it in this book. It also takes a really fine hand to blend all these narratives together. I mean, this volume could have been a cacophony of messy topics. You didn't do that. You've got this smooth, even presentation of a narrative that makes sense to the reader, especially for students to use this as a resource. Beautiful. At the same time, a couple of questions that might in the future, if you're going to do another volume, should be grade or revise this one. It surprises people when I say this. I think that the most formative literature in the Latin West, the most formative literature for Catholics and many Christians on Catholic-Jewish relations, is their liturgies. What they say, do, worship, feel, praise God, preach about in their worship services. This is especially true in the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Latin West has led the way in bigotry. The bias toward Jews for centuries in the Roman Rite was almost the model for what Luther and others adopted in various Protestant liturgies that followed the Reformation. You don't see an appreciable difference in the anti-Jewish bias before and after the Reformation. Everybody seems to hang on to that. The Roman Rite and the way in which it sees the Jewish other, the way in which it has biased it, distanced it, allowed it to become the foreground for violence against Jews, this is a very important matter. So that including those biased texts, exploring those biased texts, opens up a bit more of, how can I put this, a whole community's interiorization of Jews as other. The second thing would be, what I missed a little bit, would be a big aerial view of papal teachings on Catholic or Christian-Jewish relations since Vatican II. Nostra Aetate at Vatican II, which was the firewall for us as Catholics, and I think many Christian communities, the firewall that says we cannot go back, there is no turning back, we will not tolerate this bias at all. That needs to be brought up, I think, a bit more. And also, once again, going inside, the writings of Paul VI, John Paul, Benedict, and Francis, who love Jews, the love of the Jewish people from inside, the leaders of churches, would be, I think, a particularly helpful extra view. Lastly, the patristic sources that were chosen, I think, were very helpful. At the same time, I noted that many of the translations, the English translations used, were from quite a while ago, 100, even more, 150 years. And sometimes the translations themselves are masters of bigotry. It isn't just that the authors they're quoting or trying to render have themselves these biases, but the translators sharpen the bias for us. And new translations made directly from the original languages might be a thought, especially the genius of including Aphrahates of Persia, for example, as an alternative voice to talk about Jews. Beautiful. In sum, thank you, Ed, for this volume. Thank you for all the doors that it opens up for all of us who work so hard together in this field.
Thank you, Edward. Again, you want to pick and choose some of Father Dennis's comments?
Many thanks, Father Dennis, and for your very kind words about the book. I'll start with your last point, the patristic sources. You're absolutely right. Now, interesting, with the rabbinic sources, we translated them all from the Aramaic primarily to English. We didn't do that with patristic, and I think that was probably a mistake. The reason why some are so old is there's a certain copyright issue with however many words you take from the same book. So we were limited, and sometimes we had to go to the older sources. But your point is really well made, that sometimes the older translations carry themselves bigotry and tropes, and certainly if I can bring myself even to think about a second edition, which I can't yet because I'm still got the scars of the first, I will accommodate that. Papal teachings, it's a tricky one because, you know, there are three major documents we include from the Roman Catholic Church, Nostra Aetate, of course, being the first and foremost, but also the Pontifical Biblical Commission document, the Jewish people and the sacred scriptures in the Christian Bible, because it wasn't from the Pontifical Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews. It was from a different commission, a very important, rather lengthy, Dennis, if you don't mind me saying, document. And of course, the Gifts and Calling of God from 2015, which we thought was also important. But there's only so many Catholic statements we can include, otherwise I'd have my Protestant and Orthodox Christian friends on my back, as well as my Jewish co-religionists. Your first point, again, excellent criticism about the question of liturgy. We did include Catechism of the Council of Trent of 1566, but we were so limited by word count, Dennis, 360,000 words the press gave us, not a word over. And to stick within that, we couldn't do, for example, art. There's no artistic representations, another really important feature. Performance, as Susanna mentioned, there's no performance element, passion, narratives, things like that, which are so important in the encounter. No maps. So there are lots of things that we were unable to include. I think if one had liturgy, we'd have to handle that so carefully because we're dealing with the really fundamental, deep, profound, existential aspects of the encounter. So I'll give that more reflection. But thank you so much for those comments. There's just a few thoughts.
Good. Thank you, Edward. Yeah, you yourself put that appendix together at the end that included what you called institutional statements. But that's not to say there aren't institutional statements before that. You've got that wonderful statement from the Federal Council of Churches just prior to World War II, I think around the time of Kristallnacht, when it was issued. And the council, the Lateran Council, and certainly the Catechism of Council of Trent are all institutional statements. So don't want people to be misled. There are institutional statements scattered out. What I did find interesting is when you look at the collection, like in the collection of chapter 7, that's from World War I through the Holocaust, you see some contrasting statements. One of the questions, I've already taken a look, is about, do you cover anything regarding the Orthodox Church after 1800? And indeed, you can see a contrast between how the Orthodox Church in Romania responded and how the Orthodox Church in Bulgaria responded. Both Bulgaria and Romania joined the Axis powers as the war went along, and contributed to, I think, the war in the Balkans. But the Orthodox Church of Bulgaria stood its ground about deportation of Jews, and very few Bulgarian Jews were deported. That's correct? So that's one of the more interesting things that has been done. Father Dennis mentions the liturgical text. What's remarkable is the number of things, contributions around the Good Friday prayer. Christians, Catholics who worship on Good Friday know that there's a series of prayers that are said for church leaders, for the catechumens, those who are going to be baptized on the Easter Vigil, and national leaders, other Christians, religious, and so forth, people in need, but also people in religious groups. And the Good Friday prayer for the Jews was a bone of contention, a very negative prayer that taught by its very words and by the way it was prayed, an anti-Jewish attitude, as Father Dennis mentioned, the Roman Catholic liturgy, and how a group in the 1930s of rather prominent, some Roman cardinals, archbishops, bishops, in a kind of outreach to welcome especially secular Jews into Christianity, tried to change that prayer and were put down. However, the statement that came out that was disbanding this group, and the reason given also was an occasion where it was stated that anti-Semitism is wrong. Hatred of Jews as a race and as a people is wrong, and the church will always stand with Jews when they are persecuted as a race or as a people. So also one can follow in your book, which I found very helpful, the contrast between what is anti-Semitism and what is anti-Jewish teaching, the so-called Adversus Judaeus tradition from the earliest of times. You mentioned the fathers of the church and so forth. It's kind of interesting too. And was this a legitimate distinction at various times in history, whereas nowadays it seems to be an illegitimate distinction? And in fact, it raises questions, as Susanna echoed in her comments. Why does anti-Semitism not go away? Why is it not stamped out? And since you yourself have expanded your work to Jewish, Christian, and Muslim relations, and in many ways, why in the West is this anti-Muslim attitude so persistent? Why, especially in the West, secular people and Christians have a negative attitude towards Muslims that keeps coming back. And those of us who have worked in Muslim Christian relations, as I have for 40 years, know that we're always starting over. We're always giving that first lecture. And Muslims always want to give us that lecture of Islam 101 when we meet, because they feel they're so misunderstood. So why do these persist? That raises a rather significant question, I think. So I'll stop there and see what your comments are, and then we'll go to, yes, one of the questions raises the question of Jesus himself and understanding Jesus as a Jew, and the presentation of Jesus in the Gospels, and the understanding of Jesus as a Jew, and the Apostolic Church, by the way, the immediate founders as Jewish. What I think that plays a very key role. That theme comes through your volume as well, the discussion of this and the importance of recognizing this. So thank you.
Thank you, John. I think Susanna is the expert to reflect on anti-Semitism versus anti-Judaism, and certainly that was the selection we chose from her writings. And so I'm not going to say too much on that. I'll leave that to Susanna. I personally think there is some merit in the distinction, but it can be overdone. But it'd be interesting to see what Susanna has to say about that. I do want to touch on something you said at the end, John, and I think Susanna raised it in her reflections, which is the contemporary state of play, and where we are in terms of anti-Semitism and the dramatic rise in anti-Semitic acts and violence in the last 2 years, 18 months. And I think the point is that anti-Semitism has not disappeared, and it never had disappeared. I sometimes reflect on La Peste, Camus' great novel, which still feels like a prophetic warning. You may remember that the population of Oran in the novel, the belief that the plague is impossible, and it's that belief that anything is impossible that makes us vulnerable to it. Many of us have thought that our world had been cleared of the evil of anti-Semitism, like the concierge in the novel, who said upon hearing about the first dead rat in the building, he said, "But there are no rats." The point is that whilst anti-Semitic acts and rhetoric have increased significantly, anti-Semitism has been under the surface of our lives for a very, very long time. And the role of the church alongside the Jewish community is key in overcoming what, in Camus' words, is a disease. So I think we need to acknowledge that. And these documents in the documentary history take on the question of anti-Semitism, whether it's within patristic literature or medieval period, or frankly in the modern period. And you can see the grappling with that, not least in the Good Friday prayer for the perfidious Jews, and how that was handled within the church itself. The question about orthodoxy, thank you for raising the Bulgarian example, which is in the book, but also in the modern period. I do think it's interesting how the diaspora Orthodox community, in this case it was a Finnish monk, who reflected in the final chapter, Mary Boyce's chapter, on the state of play of Orthodox Christian Jewish relations. Seraphim Sapala, I'm sure I pronounce his surname incorrectly, but it's an interesting reflection on how the Orthodox churches can come to terms with the state of play in Christian Jewish relations. And one final remark before handing it back to you, John, and to my co-panelists, is this point about Jesus the Jew. I think I mentioned at the beginning, there are some threads, some themes that run through the 2,000 years. And obviously from the beginning, the fact that Jesus was a Jew, born a Jew, lived a Jew, taught as a Jew and died as a Jew. The first Christians were Jews. The Jesus followers carried on worshipping in the temple after the death of Christ, all these sorts of things. One of my favorite set questions is the New Testament is the collection of Jewish writings. Discuss. And this Jesus the Jew continues through time, sometimes for negative, that Christians define themselves over and against Judaism, almost denying the Jewishness of Jesus, through the modern day, when someone like Martin Buber can call Jesus my elder brother. And we Jews, I think, need to reflect on the intricate relationship with Christianity, that not only does Christianity and Christians need to understand and make right this relationship with Judaism, but we Jews need to think about the fact that as a result of this Jew from the Galilee, 2 billion Christians are reading the Tanakh. I mean, that's a profound theological challenge for Jews. We both have that challenge. And can we essentially create the theological space to affirm one another? And that is one of the motivations behind this book.
Certainly after the Second Vatican Council, I can attest to this, that a major effort was made in preaching in the Catholic Church, based upon what Nostra Aetate reminded everyone of. Jesus was a Jew, his mother was a Jew, the apostles were Jews. Even the extraordinary thought that St. Paul was a Jew and thought of himself as a Jew, and how remarkable this change, that the way the texts were preached before the council, you didn't have that sense at all, except submitting to the tradition of Judaism until a certain point and so forth. Susanna, would you like to make a comment on the interplay of the anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish theme running through the book, as Edward has presented it, and your own thoughts?
Sure. So just a few concluding comments. I wrote a book about Abraham Geiger, who was a Jewish scholar in the 19th century who wrote extensively on the origins of Christianity within Judaism, and also a book on the Quran, a very important and influential book to show the parallels between passages in the Quran and passages in religion, in rabbinic texts. And there the question in Geiger's work and his debates with primarily Protestant theologians in Germany, there the debate was not just about Jesus's Jewishness, but more the problem of Jesus's originality. That was the issue. Of course, I wrote a second book about Protestant theologians who supported Hitler and claimed that Jesus was not a Jew, but an Aryan, and Hitler was a Christ figure, etc. But the question isn't really about Jesus's Jewishness per se. I think that's pretty much resolved. The problem theologically is whether Jesus said something new and original and unique that hadn't been said by anybody else. And if so, what is it, of course? And the Jesus Seminar tried to identify it for a while and couldn't really. But if not, then what is the meaning of Christianity? And for the liberal Protestants of the time, the question was, is Christianity the religion or the faith of Jesus, or the religion about Jesus? Which is it? And they wanted the faith of Jesus, to which someone like Geiger implicitly said, the faith of Jesus is Judaism, and if you want that faith, come and join us, so to speak. So that's really the issue, not the Jewishness so much as the originality. Second point I want to make is that, yes, Christians are reading the Tanakh, as you said, Edward, but they're also claiming it. And it's not so much the reading, it's the claiming, that is the theological supersessionism, that's the issue. So did actually the 2 billion Christians spread the Tanakh to the world with the message of, here's the book of the Jews, or here's our book, and ours is the only path to salvation, and so forth? Then I would say on the question here, what's interesting is, and I have enormous admiration for someone who's included in your volume, and that is Israel Yuval, the great medieval historian from Israel, from Hebrew University, who has emphasized in his work, he's not the only one, but he's really done the great work on how Judaism itself has been shaped by Christianity. And since Passover is coming in 2 weeks, that's one of the examples that he gives. There are others, Clemens Leonhard in Germany, who says that Dayenu, which is one of the songs in the Passover Haggadah that frankly makes no sense. It says, oh, it would have been enough if you had taken us out of Egypt, but not brought us to Mount Sinai, or it would have been enough if you had brought us to Mount Sinai and not given us the Torah. Well, of course, that's nonsense. It certainly would not have been enough. But he's saying it's a response to the improperia, the Christian liturgy that says Jews have no gratitude. So even liturgically, Judaism is shaped by Christianity. The first thing you do at the Passover Seder is hold up the matzah and say, halach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction. Why do you do that? Because you're saying this is not the body of Christ. So there is a way in which Christianity is derived from Judaism, and Judaism is derived from Christianity. And that that's something that Yuval has made very clear in his work, and others too, that again raises theological questions, not about originality so much as what does it mean to be so intimately and intricately engaged with a different religion. Islam has it too, but in a different way, with a much lower tone, let's say. And then finally, you asked about anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. And you used something that I wrote in your volume on this question. I'll just say briefly that I spent a great deal of time having to plow through anti-Semitic texts from Germany from the late 19th century through the Nazi period. What I found is that what is called racial anti-Semitism actually worries about Jewish moral and spiritual degeneracy. They're not worried about the Jewish body per se. My body isn't going to attack somebody, but they're worried the Jews are immoral and spiritually degenerate, and that immorality will affect the larger German society. And the Germans are vulnerable to this spiritual degeneracy. And this spiritual degeneracy is somehow incarnate in the Jewish body. And the only way to get rid of it is to destroy the body. So in that sense, the kind of argument that I hear among what are called racial anti-Semites is the same as the kind of argument I might hear from a village pastor who wants to rant against Judaism in some way. So the distinction between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism is at best very slippery. But I would say it's not a useful distinction. It covers up more than it reveals. So thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Father Dennis, do you want to join in this discussion at this point with anything?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking long and hard here about what Susanna has said. And yet I'm thrown back on John Paul II's very interesting talk from October of '97. He had that conference at the Vatican called The Roots of Anti-Judaism in the Church, I guess. And he says this, in his opinion, the taproot of anti-Judaism is the failure of Christians to read their own scriptures in a Jewish context. And that when that context is restored, you see an opening up of the Christian mind. There's like, oh, who is this Jesus then? I meet him again for the first time, but now he is edu. Huh? I like to draw the distinction between the poisonous results of anti-Jewish reading versus the commitment to elimination of Jews, eliminationism, and of racial Judaism. I know a lot of fundamentalist Protestant pastors and all that who would say, I would never act against a Jew in this way, but I guess, Susanna, it's a kind of supersessionism still that's inside that Catholic or that Christian imagination that says, I can't quite learn to read these texts yet in a Jewish context. There's a holding on to that. But I do think there's a difference between them. And as Ed said earlier, there's at least a limited usefulness in making a distinction. I'm not sure politically how far it goes, but theologically, I can see a difference.
Thank you, Father Dennis. That's helpful. We talked about liturgy and what people do and other forms rather than some written text. There is a question about Oberammergau, but you don't address that, do you?
Thanks, John, and thank you, Susanna and Dennis again. Do I address Oberammergau in my classes, but not in this book? And I think that the performance, the passion narratives are, and how Oberammergau has developed into a much more positive representation as Jesus as a Jew. Jesus wearing a yarmulke, for example, I think even wearing a talit, saying the prayers, saying the Shema, in a way that everybody who sees the play, I'm told, because I've only read the text, but I got my students to read the 1950 text versus the 2020 text and see that fundamental mental transformation into a very different narrative and performance about Jews and Judaism. If I can, John, I'd like to respond to a couple of things that there's an image of the book. I meant to put that up earlier. A couple of things that Susanna and Dennis said. First of all, starting with you, Dennis. Yes, John Paul II, and you'll notice that the final chapter begins in 1978. We had a lot of fun deciding at what point to begin, and that year was chosen partly because it gave Mary a chance to review only 30 years or nearly, and of course the election of John Paul II. And I do think the recognition of the Jewish context of Christianity still needs to be integrated into the Christian psyche. It has at many levels, certainly levels of scholarship. But I think in the pew and sometimes in the pulpit, that's not yet happened. The recognition, I would suggest, that this is a family relationship, and in a family relationship, you don't always get along. And historically, that's certainly been the case. But understanding the relationship, particularly in those texts that are polemical and anti-Jewish, seeing it as an internal Jewish argument rather than as a Christian argument against Jews is really important, providing that context. And nothing would be better, in my appendix on the biblical narratives and the biblical commentaries illustrates that we continue to have an encounter on the pages of Scripture. Sometimes polemical, as Susan hinted at, in terms of Geiger questioning the originality, and not just Geiger, of course. A number of Jewish scholars of that period questioned to what extent Christianity was original, and that it all began with Paul, for example, was another line that was taken by some Jewish scholars. But that Jewish context and the familial environment, I think, is really important. In terms of Susanna's question about the claim of Scripture, such an interesting one, because you're quite right. Historically, in so many ways, Christians have claimed the Tanakh or the Old Testament exclusively. But I think that's no longer the case, or at least in theory, that's no longer the case. And in some ways, the relationship with the Orthodox Church is more straightforward because of the unity of the Bible. Too often I would attend a church service and there would be too much of the sloppy replacement theology. This is what it said here, and this is how it was fulfilled there. And there's still work to be done. But I don't believe that the exclusive claims are as prevalent today, or at least I'd like not to believe that, as they were historically. But your point, Susanna, about how Judaism can be shaped by Christianity, and you highlight the passage from Yuval, is absolutely right. And the exegetical encounter shows that. My own work on the Akedah, sacrifice of Isaac, shows that Christianity and Christian interpretation influenced the Jewish interpretation to such an extent that Genesis Rabbah described Isaac carrying the cross like a man who carries his cross. Sorry, Isaac carrying the wood, forgive me, in verse 5:22, is called in Genesis Rabbah like a man who carries a cross. Saluv is the word, so clearly influenced by Christian teaching. So again, thank you so much for your remarks, and also everybody online. I know we haven't been able to answer all of the questions, and where there are mistakes or omissions and gaps when it comes to another volume, if the press would be kind enough to allow a few more words and a little bit more breadth, I'd love to be able to include things like the liturgy, the passion narratives, and the artistic representations as well. But we can only manage with the constraints we all have.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Edward. We haven't been able to answer all of the questions. There was one comment about the anti-Semitism in North America before World War II, Henry Ford, Father Coughlin, Father Feeney. Well, Father Coughlin is in the volume. You have an excerpt from Father Coughlin and comments. The commentaries were very, very helpful. And in fact, you find yourself reading a text and you quickly look at the commentary. Why am I reading this text? And it really helps you to go back and to read that text. So thank you for doing.
Funny enough, John, just on that, we had a debate, Neil and I, about whether to have the commentary following the text or the commentary before the text. And we did it afterwards to stop people going straight to the commentary.
I think it was better to have it afterwards, to look at the text first. But, it's not just commentary. Another form of commentary is preaching. And that's that's rather significant in that whatever is happening on an institutional level has to be preached to the people, because that's where they're going to learn it. And so that's an onus that I think we Christians have on us to work better at by far. Well, thank you. And thank you all. Thank you, Susanna and Father Dennis, for joining us. Edward, we appreciate the volume. I'm sure you're going to get lots of comments as you continue. There it is. So, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this book presentation, The Documentary History, or A Documentary History of Jewish-Christian Relations.